Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendivid Books. There's one critical question at the top of everyone's mind. How worrying is Omicron? And the answer to that question depends upon three other critical questions. How transmissible is it? In other words, how many people will it infect? Will it lead to serious illness and hospitalization? And finally, can it resist immunity, both from vaccination as well as from previous infection? Joining me to answer those three questions is someone who's widely considered one of the world's greatest experts on public health, Professor and Dean of Brown University's School of Public Health, Ashish Jha. Professor Jha, let's start with the first of those three critical questions. It's widely reported, and in fact, it's now widely believed, that Omicron is more infectious than Delta, more infectious than all variants of coronavirus. But is that based on anecdotal evidence, or do we now have good facts to support this belief?
So, Karan, thank you for starting us off with that question. It's critical. There is, I would say, preliminary data that it may be more transmissible. I do not think we are anywhere near definitive on that. I'll tell you what the preliminary data is. We are looking at South Africa in one particular province where Omicron has become dominant, and the number of infections is rising very, very quickly. And so the presumption is that it is more contagious. But there are other explanations as well that could explain it. So I don't think that the definitive answer is in, but it is concerning that it might be more contagious.
Let me put some of the data that I've just gleaned from television news, the BBC in particular, this evening. South Africa's National Institute for Communicable Diseases reports that in the last 2 days, cases have jumped from 4,300 a day to 8,500 a day to 11,500 a day. And compared to the daily increase in mid-November, which is 200 or 300 a day, this is a 14-fold increase. The positivity rate is said to be 16.5%. And finally, 74% of samples genome sequenced in November were all Omicron. Does that suggest to you, on the basis of this data, that A, it is growing very fast, and secondly, it's probably outcompeting Delta?
Yeah, so the first question, yes, it is clearly growing very, very fast, faster than we saw the Delta wave take off in South Africa. And that's what has so many of us very concerned. The question of, is it really outcompeting Delta? The problem is that there wasn't that much Delta around in South Africa a month ago. That the number of infections in South Africa was actually quite low. And therefore, it looks like it's outcompeting Delta, but in the context of not a lot of Delta. Do I think that it's going to end up being more transmissible than Delta? It very well might be. And that data is concerning. We just need a little bit more information before we can feel confident that this is a more contagious variant. It very well might be. I think the lean of the evidence is it is, but I don't think it's definitive.
I hear what you say, that there wasn't very much Delta around a month ago, and therefore appearances would suggest it's outcompeting Delta. But if there wasn't very much Delta, it's not difficult to outcompete it. But let me put to you what Anne von Gottberg, a South African scientist, is reported to have said to the World Health Organization just a couple of days ago. And I'm quoting her. "We believe the number of cases will increase exponentially in all provinces of the country." Do you share that fear, or do you think it's a possibly initial but exaggerated response? And secondly, if it is true that it will increase exponentially in South Africa, could that also happen in other countries where Omicron emerges?
Yes. So two very good questions. Let's start with the first one. I do worry that it's going to grow very rapidly across South Africa. Obviously, it has gone very, very quickly in the province where Johannesburg is. That's where the big takeoff has been. But when you look at the other provinces of South Africa, it's starting to really accelerate. So I am very worried that it is going to accelerate across the entire country. And that's going to cause significant strains on their healthcare system, on their population. To your and again, we don't know for sure, but that's what it looks like in South Africa. Very concerning. On the second question of Well, do we expect this to play out, let's say in India? Is the same thing going to happen, or in America? Different countries are different and they have different contexts. There are several ways in which, let's say, India is different from South Africa. Two is India has had, and again, there are different estimates of what proportion of the population has been infected, let's say from the Delta wave, but it is probably higher than the proportion of population that was infected. So you have maybe more natural immunity, infection-induced immunity in India. Second, the very big difference is vaccinations. India has done an extraordinarily good job on getting people vaccinated over the last 7 months, 6-7 months, especially in the last 3-4 months. Just an extraordinarily good job. And a far more vaccinated population may experience this variant very differently. So I think South Africa, very concerning. I would not automatically assume that it's going to play out in exactly the same way, but we obviously have to think about how is it going to affect India.
One more question about transmissibility before I come to the second big issue: will it create serious disease? The BBC reports that most of the people infected with Omicron in South Africa are young. What does that tell us?
Not much yet. And I'll tell you why. What happens with most infections, most variants, it is almost always starts with young people. Why? Young people are the ones who are traveling. Young people tend to be much more social and they're spending time. Whereas, older people, particularly in the pandemic, have been a bit more careful, a little bit more at home, a little bit less socially active. So infections almost always begin with young people, and then they spread rapidly to older people because, of course, young people don't live in a bubble. They live in housing and homes with older people, et cetera. So I expect that even though it has begun with young people, I expect it to travel, and you're going to see more and more increases among older people in South Africa.
Let's then at that point, Professor Jha, come to the second big issue, and it's to do with whether Omicron will lead to serious disease. Again, there's a widespread belief, and this time not just in South Africa, but probably in every country in Europe or India where in fact Omicron has manifested itself, that the illness being caused is mild. The question is, can we rely on these reports, which are really just based on the first week of infection, or do we need to watch and see what happens in the second critical week and maybe even in the third before we conclude that it is really going to be just mild?
Yeah. Obviously, all of us hope that it is mild. That would be lovely. That would make an enormous difference if it was mild. I've seen no evidence so far that makes me feel comfortable that this is going to be mild. The anecdotes are just that, and they're exactly what you would expect. If you think about who's been getting identified, people who are getting identified are a lot of them are travelers. By the way, why are we identifying travelers first? Because who we're testing first, right? The mental model is it might have come from South Africa. We don't think it started in South Africa, but wherever. Let's say the mental model is people who've traveled. Those are the people getting tested for Omicron right now. And so that's where we're finding it. They tend to be younger. They tend to be healthier. They tend to be vaccinated. So what is happening is we're testing the lowest risk people, lowest risk for severity, highest risk for infection, and they look like they're having relatively mild disease. This is exactly what we would expect. I've seen no data so far that makes me feel comfortable that this will end up being a mild version. I desperately wish that it turns out that way, but my wishing that it turns out that way does not necessarily mean it will. We've got to get some more data in the next week or two.
Now, one way of judging whether the disease is going to be mild is to look at hospitalization in South Africa. And I noticed that in the last 36 hours, in fact, there has been an increase in hospitalization. But the key question is, does that increase in hospitalization suggest virulence and serious disease? Or is it just that more people are getting infected because Omicron is more infectious and is more transmissible, and therefore more people are ending up in hospital? Which of the two?
We don't know. That's a very good question. And unfortunately, I feel bad because I keep saying we don't know. I will tell you, I'm looking at the data on hospitalizations in South Africa. It's taking off very, very quickly. We don't understand all the mechanisms. Again, this is all very new just in the last few days. The substantial increase in hospitalizations is one of the things that gives me pause about the idea that this is somehow a mild disease. again, my mental expectation is it's going to be about the same level of severity as Delta or other variants, but obviously we hope not. The increase in hospitalizations really does concern me, and we're seeing a very sharp increase. Remember, Karan, every single infection of this coronavirus, the infection precedes hospitalizations by about 7 to 10 days. And therefore, when you see a spike in cases that first 7 to 10 days, it always looks like, oh, big increase in cases, no hospitalizations. Maybe this will turn out to be mild. That has been the whole story of this entire pandemic, especially because it begins with young, healthy people. But as it spreads, it always turns out that older people end up, and as time goes on, people end up getting hospitalized. So I would say we just have to wait probably another week or two. We'll have a lot more data. The other question, of course, I'm asking is are the hospitalizations among unvaccinated or vaccinated people? That will also tell us about severity.
Can I answer that? Can
Yes.
I answer that? Because that was a point made this evening on the BBC, not by their reporter and correspondent, but one of the experts they were interviewing. And she
Yes.
said almost all the hospitalization are people who are unvaccinated.
Yeah, the data I've seen suggests about 3% of their hospitalizations are vaccinated people. That's very good news so far, but again, very early, and one can't overstate these things too much and have too much reliance. But yes, the early data suggests that it's primarily unvaccinated people.
Let's then come to that third critical question. Does the fact Omicron has 50 mutations overall, with 32 in the spike protein and 10 in the receptor binding domain, suggest that it will be more resistant to immunity, both perhaps from vaccination as well as from previous infection? Because clearly, a lot of scientists world over seem to believe this is very likely. But on the other hand, and once again, I'm relying on the BBC, almost all the people in hospital, 97%, as you said, are unvaccinated. So what should we believe? Are vaccines going to be threatened by Omicron, or are vaccines working, which is why which is why only 3% of people in hospital are vaccinated?
Yeah, this is the big question. So let me walk you through how I think about it. First of all, the mutations in the receptor binding domain of the spike protein are the things that concern all of us, because that's where our most important antibodies target the virus. And so there is good reason to be concerned that our antibodies are going to work less well. What does that mean? What that means is we may see more breakthrough infections. We may see more fully vaccinated people having infections. But remember, the immune system has antibodies that are very, very important. But the immune system also has T cells and B cells. And T cells are these immune cells that are critical for preventing severe illness. And most of us believe, not the data, but believe that T cell immunity will remain intact because our T cells are very sophisticated in their ability to manage these kinds of things. So if you've been vaccinated, your T cell immunity is intact, you should be able to prevent severe illness. So what we might see, and again, I'm just speculating, is a lot of breakthrough infections, but relatively few people getting very severely ill among vaccinated. Of course, among unvaccinated people, it's a whole different ballgame. So that's what we might see. Now, let me make one more point, which is everybody says, so when will we know? When will we know more? Laboratory studies are being done right now. They probably started this past, a week ago, as soon as this variant was identified. Those laboratory studies will give us some preliminary data on how well the antibodies are neutralizing the virus. I expect that data in the next week. I don't think we have to wait much longer than the next week. We will know how well the antibodies are neutralizing the virus. That will give us a lot of insights about how much breakthrough infections we should be expecting.
Let me just repeat something you said, because if I heard you correctly, it's hugely reassuring. Laboratory studies within a week will tell us whether vaccines are effective against Omicron, or whether our fears that effectiveness has gone down will be proven correct. So within a week, the tension that people feel should disappear.
Well, let me just add one bit of clarification, which is the laboratory studies are very, very helpful. They're not definitive, but they will give us a lot more insight. So right now we are speculating by looking at sort of third-hand information of hospitalizations, et cetera. There's a lot that can confound that. Laboratory studies will give us much stronger direction. It's not going to be definitive. It may take a little longer to feel fully confident, but yes, we will know more within a week.
Now, Professor Jha, what we're talking about when we talk about vaccines and their efficacy is breakthrough infections. But the French news agency AFP has today, the 3rd of December, carried a study or a report on a study by a lady called Juliette Pulliam, who is the director of the South African Center of Excellence in Epidemiological Modeling and Analysis. And this study, according to the agency, suggests that Omicron is 3 times more likely to cause reinfections compared to Delta or Beta. And I just want to underline for the audience, this is not breakthrough infections, which is what happens when vaccines prove to be less infectious or ineffective. These are infections that happen despite the fact you have a previous infection. Does that study hint or suggest that previous infection will not be much protection against Omicron?
Yeah, it does. And again, I haven't fully reviewed that study. It's brand new, but I will say 2 things about reinfections, infections from previously infected people. In general, we know that if you've been previously infected, you have very high levels of protection against reinfection for about 3 months. Beyond 3 months, that protection probably begins to wane. And you may have some protection at 6, 9, or 12 months. We just don't know how much protection. What we're seeing a little bit of data, again, this study in South Africa and elsewhere, is that we're seeing more reinfections than we generally see. That is consistent with the idea that there is more immune escape, that the immunity that you build up from a prior infection is not going to keep you in good enough shape to prevent infection. This is why I believe everybody who's been previously infected and recovered needs to get vaccinated, because the best immunity, the highest level of immunity, is someone who's had a prior infection and then gets vaccinated. We call that hybrid immunity. That is really the best immunity. And that's what anybody who's been previously infected should be getting right now. They should be getting vaccinated so that they're going to be able to manage this virus.
So what you said both about the possibility, I'm not saying likelihood, but the possibility that the mutations could make this more resistant to vaccines, and also what we've discovered from this study that reinfections are possibly greater here than they were for Delta or for Beta, both of them underline the need for boosters. If not for every adult, then at least particularly for people over 60 and people with comorbidities. Would you agree?
I do agree with that. And, I know there's a very robust debate right now about timing of boosters and who should get boosters and when. The clear evidence in my mind is if you've gotten your second shot recently, you don't need a booster. But if you are at least 3 months out, maybe, and if you're 6 months out and you're a high risk person, you're an elderly person, a person with significant chronic disease, you should absolutely be getting a booster. To me, that part is very clear.
Let me then put this to you. If boosters are essential, particularly for people who have comorbidities or are above 60 or above 65, then the question is, which vaccine should be the booster? Given that Omicron's mutations are on the spike protein and on the receptor binding domain, which are areas which existing vaccines target, my question is this: which would be the most effective vaccine for a booster? An mRNA or a virus vector, which anyway targets those spike proteins, or what's called an inactivated whole virus vaccine, which, because it, I'm told, targets the whole virus, would be able to overcome the fact that mutations on the binding domain may make other vaccines less effective. So which of the two?
I think so. This is one where we have absolutely no idea, no data. But it's not that we have no idea, it's just we have no data. So let me tell you a couple of things. I mean, the part about Omicron that worries us is those mutations on the spike protein, but it also has mutations elsewhere. It also has mutations on its N protein, nucleocapsid protein, and other parts. So whether the Covaxin vaccine, for instance, whether that's going to end up being better, I don't know. I honestly don't know. So those studies should be getting done, and they are probably getting done right now. And the way to begin to do those studies is to get the antibodies, get the blood of the people who've been vaccinated from Covaxin versus Covishield versus, let's say, Pfizer. And we should be looking at their generated antibodies and then running it against the Omicron variant to see whether we get better neutralization with one over another. I think we should be able to get that data reasonably quickly. Right now, it's speculation to say one is going to end up being a better booster than another.
I'll just quickly explain to the audience your reference to Covaxin. Covaxin is what's called an inactivated whole virus vaccine. And there is a certain debate in India that Covaxin may be more effective as a booster than, say, Covishield, which is a virus vector vaccine. And we just don't know, is what you're saying. We don't have data. And this is something where data is needed, not just theoretical postulation.
Yeah, and I think we can get some data relatively quickly, meaning no one is saying you have to wait 6 months to get data. We can get laboratory data on this in the next week or two. On the question of Covaxin versus Covishield, I'm sure there are Indian scientists working on that right now. We can get that data very, very quickly, at least some preliminary laboratory data. It will help guide us. I have to tell you, my personal guess is it's probably not going to make a big difference whether you get a Covishield booster or a Covaxin booster. That's my personal guess. I don't like guessing. I actually like data.
One more question on vaccines. And here I suspect, I'll be honest, is I'm asking you for your hunch. Do you think we might need Omicron-specific vaccines, i.e. vaccines that are tweaked for this variant? And if the answer is yes, should we be working on them now rather than wait to be certain and then start and lose, say, 4-6 weeks in the process?
We should start working on them now. I don't know if whether we'll need it. We will know more on that in 4 to 6 weeks, but 4 to 6 weeks is too long to wait. So I know that Moderna and Pfizer are beginning to work on Omicron-specific variants, vaccines. I assume that that is starting to happen with Covishield, with AstraZeneca. Don't know for sure. I would not be waiting, only because, imagine that the vaccines take a very large on effectiveness. Imagine that we need an Omicron-specific vaccine booster. 6 weeks could end up being quite a long time to have lost. And so to get going on that right away is critical. And if it turns out we don't need it, okay, so we spent some time, we built, doesn't come without a cost, but I think that's a cost we can live with if we don't end up needing it. I hope we don't end up needing it.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but I want to ask you a different sort of question, but one that is of great concern to the audience. There are several reports and credible reports that suggest that Omicron may be easier to detect, even if not conclusively, than perhaps other variants. And this is because it's reported that RTPCR tests can detect Omicron because of what's called the S gene dropout factor. Now, I'm well aware that all RT-PCR tests don't look for the S gene. But in the case of those that do they conclusively detect Omicron, or do you still need genome sequencing to confirm it?
Yeah, this is a fabulous question. The short answer is no, they don't conclusively, but it is actually a very, very helpful tool because, and majority of RT-PCR, certainly in the US and Europe, but I assume that just has to do with which reagents you're using and which primers you're using. But certainly India has more than enough capability of using RT-PCR that will be able to give you what we call the SGTF, the S gene target failure. It's just part of the PCR test. And we can actually use it quite effectively to track the spread of Omicron. What we will want to do is confirm it. So every time you see an SGTF early days, you want to go ahead and sequence that to make sure that it is in fact Omicron. But my guess would be that at this point in India, where the dominant variant is Delta, which does not have the SGTF, if you see SGTF taking off, it is almost surely Omicron, and we can do some verification with sequencing. But this is actually one of the features of this variant, is that allows us to use RT-PCR to track how quickly it is spreading.
And therefore, it is somewhat easier to track than other variants were.
Absolutely.
Now, Professor Jha, we've discussed all the three critical questions I mentioned in my introduction very thoroughly. You've given me a very comprehensive answer to all three of them. Let me then put this to you. Were scientists In the first few days after Omicron was detected and reported, correct to call it horrific? Correct to call it the worst ever? Or do you think those judgments were somewhat hasty, if not unwarranted as well?
Well, look, the variant looks so concerning under the microscope. And when you look at the mutations, it is really unlike anything we have seen. Karan, every month, every 2 months, we hear of a new variant. Delta, obviously very important, but then Mu and Lambda, and most of them turn out to be nothing. And most of them have not raised my concern. When I saw the series of mutations and where they were, I too became very concerned about this. So I think, the initial reactions can be a little bit dramatic, but I think the reasons for concern are there. And what I always say is, okay, good. And we have reasons for concern. Now let's turn that into finding evidence and data so we can understand not just should we be concerned, but what are the concerns and what do we need to address those concerns?
If I understand you correctly, and I am interpreting you, you're saying that in the very first few days after Omicron was detected and reported, there is a certain amount of understanding for the fact that people thought prima facie, this is horrific, this is terrible. But now, a week or 8 days later, we need to be more modulated and more calibrated in our response and perhaps not go for such hyperbolic language.
Yeah, and I would say one other thing, which is it is not helpful to say something is horrific. What does that mean, horrific? Horrific in which way? And what do we need to do about it? And so I think the 3 questions you laid out are the 3 questions that we always ask about every variant. And this one may turn out to be bad in one of those areas, but not bad in one of the other areas. And we will have to see. At this point, it's all about answering those 3 questions in detail. And that will give us the roadmap for how we counter this variant. And let me say one last thing. We are not back in March of 2020. We are not at the beginning of the pandemic anymore. Whatever this turns out to be, we have so many tools to manage this variant that we will get through this. We will manage it. We will do it appropriately. Right now, it's all about getting the data.
Then picking up on what you said, that we are not back to March 2020, we've got pretty close to 2 years of experience and knowledge and understanding, which we didn't have 18, 19 months ago. What then against that background do you make of governments' reactions and the reactions of politicians the world over? Instead of congratulating South African scientists for the remarkable speed with which they detected and reported this variant, and let's remember how slow the Chinese were in the case of the Wuhan variant, instead of congratulating South Africa for its speed, the world has instead imposed travel bans and effectively slammed the door on the country.
Yeah, there are 2 sets of issues in my mind. On one is, look, politicians always feel like they need to act quickly to show that they're taking things seriously. That's fine. That is a truism of politicians in America, in the UK, in India, everywhere. That's a feature. That's okay. The question is, how do they act and what are the costs of their action and benefits of their actions? I think in the first couple of days, saying we need to get more information on what's happening with this made sense. But travel bans almost never work. They don't actually end up preventing spread of a virus. They can slow things down a little bit. But there is a bigger issue here, which you raise. None of us, no one I know, thinks that this variant started in South Africa. We think it was detected by South Africa because the South African scientists are terrific. They're world class. And they also have another feature, which is they're very open and transparent with the world. What South Africa did was give us a gift. They gave us a gift of an early warning. And if we have a world where everybody who gives you an early warning, you punish them, I can promise you that nobody in the future will want to give an early warning. So that's why we have to be thoughtful. If you've put in a travel ban, this is the right moment to lift the travel ban. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. We can do border controls. We can ask people to be tested. We can ask for people to be vaccinated. We can, even if you're really worried, you can ask people to be quarantined for 7 days or 10 days after they return. There are other mechanisms. Travel bans, in my mind, are really problematic. And they're going to lead us in the long run to a much worse place, because what the signal to the world is, don't be open, don't be transparent, you will be punished.
One last question. Does the fact that Omicron is centered so much around Africa and Southern Africa, not just South Africa, raise once again the whole critical issue of vaccine inequity? I notice that only 11.2 or 3% of that entire continent has had one jab, and just about 7% have had two jabs. And for the rest of the world, we're now reaching levels of 60, 70% and more for two jabs. Even India is poised to be 50% double jab. In comparison, Africa is woefully under-vaccinated. So does this once again point out the need to get rid of vaccine inequity and make sure vaccines are available in Africa? And secondly, could there be a link between vaccine inequity and the emergence of this strain?
Yeah. Two good questions. So question number one on vaccine inequity, huge problem. The fact that only 7% of the African continent has had two jabs, totally unacceptable. If you ask the question why, issue is that we used to believe this pandemic has ended this belief. We used to believe that we live in a global manufacturing context where India, for instance, has been the global manufacturing of vaccines for the world. And therefore, the strategy was, okay, Serum Institute would vaccinate much of Africa, or the vaccine manufacturing in Europe and the United States would lead to vaccinations in Africa. None of that has happened. What you have seen in general is vaccine nationalism, countries holding on to their own vaccine doses. I understand that. Look, India went through a horrific period of time. The need to get Indians vaccinated, of course, I support fully. But what that has done is it has left Africa without vaccines. And so we have, in my mind, there are two strategies here. There's a short-term issue. We have got to get more vaccines right away. And second, I'm confident the African continent, the African Union, countries in Africa will never again rely on manufacturing of other countries. And so you will see an explosion of domestic manufacturing on the African continent as this pandemic comes to an end. But in the short run, until that is available, we have got to get more vaccine doses. To your other question, so I'm going to get to your other question very quickly. Is there a linkage between unvaccinated, the lack of vaccination of Africa, and maybe the rise of variants? Here's what we know. In general, the more infections you have in unvaccinated people, the more mutations you have, the higher the risk of variants. So there is absolutely a link. Did this one come because you had a large unvaccinated population? We never know individually. But overall, the pandemic will not come to an end until we have a lot more people vaccinated. Until then, should expect more variants.
I want to end by quoting to you what Angelique Coetzee, the head of the South African Medical Association, said to me in an interview just 5 days ago. She said, "No one is safe in the world until Africa is vaccinated." And then she added, "If the world treats Africa like a stepchild, then the rich countries can't sleep comfortably at night." Would you agree?
I would. And I think as importantly, we shouldn't just be doing this because it's in our own self-interest. We should be doing this because we want to live in a world where you're born should not dictate how you're going to handle a pandemic. We should be getting people vaccinated because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Jha. I'm very grateful for this comprehensive interview, which I hope will put Omicron in perspective for people and reassure them, because when people are more informed, they also tend to understand the situation they face a lot better. Take care, stay safe, and keep away from Greek alphabets.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.